The 1880 U.S. presidential election was a very close race between Democrat Winfield Hancock and Republican James Garfield, who would end up winning the election by a pretty slim margin. In a campaign fought mainly over the issues of Civil War loyalties, tariffs, and Chinese immigration, the election saw Garfield win the popular vote by only 2,000 votes, but handedly won the electoral vote with 214 to Hancock's 155, when either candidate only needed 185 electoral votes to win. Now you might be asking yourself, who is Winfield Hancock? He was named after war hero Winfield Scott, who also had run for the presidency unsuccessfully in 1852. Anyway, Winfield Hancock was a career U.S. Army officer with an extensive career in the Mexican-American War, and especially in the U.S. Civil War, where he was known as the hero of Gettysburg and was thanked by Congress for his strong defense. One military historian would write that no other Union general at Gettysburg dominated men by sheer force of their presence more completely than Hancock. On the campaign trail, practical differences between the two major party candidates were very few. The Republicans began the campaign with the very familiar theme of waving the bloody shirt, reminding Northern voters that the Democrat Party was responsible for secession and the 4 years of Civil War, and that if they held power again, they would reverse the gains of the war, dishonor Union veterans, and pay Confederate soldiers' pensions out of the federal treasury. However, this strategy was getting very old by 1880, especially against Hancock, who was himself a Union general. Democrats, meanwhile, campaigned on the characters of each candidate, attacking Garfield for his connection with the Credit Mobilier of America scandal of the early 1870s, where many members of Congress were bribed by the railroad company Credit Mobilier Corporation. Democrats used the incident as a contrast with Hancock, who, as a career Army officer, stood apart from Congress and lobbyists. Democrats never made clear what their victory would do to improve the nation, as their platform was more like Hancock is better than Garfield. Many in the Republican Party were also reluctant to directly criticize the hero of Gettysburg, but they did characterize Hancock as uninformed on many issues, and some of his former comrades-in-arms gave critical speeches regarding his character. One major issue that Republicans would target Hancock on was tariffs. The tariff issue cut Democrat support in the industrial northern states, which were essential in establishing a Democrat Party majority, as they supported tariffs. Hancock made the situation worse when, attempting to strike a moderate stance, he had said the tariff question is a local question. While not completely inaccurate, as the tariff preferences often reflected local concerns, the issue was at odds with Democrats' platform and suggested that Hancock did not understand the issue very well. Also, Republicans made him appear very unsympathetic to northern states, which cost him dearly. In the end, Garfield won, and Hancock attended Garfield's inauguration and retained his position in the military, and all was well, until Garfield's assassination not even a year into his term. Garfield was assassinated by a schizophrenic guy named Charles Guiteau, who believed that he was personally responsible for Garfield's victory in 1880, and when he wasn't appointed to a cabinet position, the schizo decided that Garfield needed to die. As a side note, the assassin had previously supported Horace Greeley in 1872 and thought that if Greeley had won that election, then he would be appointed to a cabinet position as well. So yeah, this wacko was executed in 1882. Vice President Arthur would then assume the office of the presidency and sign the Chinese Exclusionary Act, which resulted in a pretty bad tension between the United States and China, as well as a series of violent racial crimes against Chinese immigrants in California. However, Arthur's Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, had a greater involvement in affairs south of the Rio Grande and proposed a Pan-American Conference in 1882 to discuss trade and an end to the war in the Pacific, which had been fought by Bolivia, Chile, and Peru. Arthur would also build up the American Navy and didn't run again in 1884, referring to his time in the presidency as being like in a prison. But what if, in an alternate timeline, Winfield Hancock won the 1880 election? Changes would need to occur in order to produce a Hancock victory would be if Democrats didn't really campaign on tariffs as much to prevent alienating northern industrial states. Actually, Hancock would only need to get 20,000 votes in New York to defeat Garfield, and since tariffs were a big issue there, I feel like not talking about them as much would be heavily aiding him in the state. Another change to occur in this alternate timeline to have Hancock win would be changing his running mate. In our timeline, Hancock had William Hayden English from Indiana on his ticket, as Democrats believed that English would be able to get Indiana to vote Democrat. However, that didn't happen. In the previous election of 1876, both Indiana and New York voted Democrat with Samuel Tilden's campaign. In our timeline, Tilden was very popular with the Democratic Party, but refused to run again. So in this alternate timeline, Tilden will become Hancock's running mate and have New York go Democrat. So now that Hancock has won the election, what's his term going to be like? First, Hancock's platform, of course, had his reputation as a war hero at Gettysburg combined with his status as a prominent Democrat with impeccable Unionist credentials. But he also held a pro-states' rights view as a solid means of reconciling with former Confederate states, as he supported Andrew Johnson's policies to bring the states back into the Union by any means necessary. His domestic term would see him applying the tariffs that were mentioned earlier, which will make the industrial North upset with Hancock. But Hancock likely didn't really care much about the tariffs, as he immediately had moderated his stance after alienating the North, which was not in line with the Democrats, what they were wanting to do. So with that, I'd say that Hancock just lets Congress decide on tariffs, as he himself didn't really think it was that big a deal. On the issue of Chinese immigration, all parties had pledged to limit Chinese immigration in California, and Democrats had even made a fake letter from Garfield saying that he would keep immigration as it already was. This shows that Democrats were even more hardcore against Chinese immigration in 1880. But perhaps Hancock would just limit Chinese immigration instead of outright banning it like Arthur had done, but that of course may just be wishful thinking. But in general, Hancock was seen as a bipartisan figure, as he was a staunch supporter of the Union and a Civil War hero, yet also a states' rights Democrat. For example, he would also play a leading role in organizing and participating in former President Grant's funeral in 1885. Hancock's incorruptible image and time as president would also make him popular among the American public, especially in contrast to the matchless corruption and scandals of the 1870s. In foreign affairs, Hancock will not have Blaine as his Secretary of State, so the United States likely doesn't play as big a role in ending the war in the Pacific in 1882. However, the governments of Peru and Bolivia turned as their last hope to the United States to block the Chilean annexation of the occupied territories. Hancock would also probably then diplomatically get involved with the Monroe Doctrine, as these South American states also feared a European intervention during the war. I can't say for sure what I think the impacts of this would be, though. For the 1884 election, if Winfield Scott Hancock decides to seek another term, he would undoubtedly win against James G. Blaine. But if Hancock runs again, then he will die in office in 1886, and he would have also had to change his vice president from Tilden due to Tilden's poor health. But if Hancock doesn't run, then I believe that Grover Cleveland would win the Democrat nomination, and things would then go the pretty historical path, just with less anti-Chinese immigration policies, as Hancock limits immigration instead of outright banning it. This is just one possible scenario, and I know not too much changed compared to our timeline, but that's the thing about alternate history. Sometimes these big changes occur, but sometimes very little happens. But what do you think would have happened if Winfield Scott Hancock had won the 1880 U.S. presidential election? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.